Okay, where we ended last week, last Friday, was the United States was totally neutral. We were staying out of foreign affairs. We were staying minding our own business, even in our own backyard in the Western Hemisphere with places like Cuba and Mexico. While, now I know if you are watching this online, you can't see the chart I've got on the board, but while we are minding our own business, we've got Hitler coming to power, we've got Hitler remilitarizing against the Treaty of Versailles in 1935, and then we got Hitler taking the Rhineland in 1936. We've got Japan had already invaded northern Manchuria once. It's called Manchuria, it's a part of northern China in 1931. Italy invading Ethiopia in 1935, and a revolt in Spain where the fascists are trying to take over in Spain against the democracy. And the mentality is in America for most people, probably 70% of the people, is let's stay out of that mess. So in 1937, Japan invaded China again, this time the rest of China. This, I don't have like a whole bunch of stuff on this because we're talking about the American version of World War II, but there was something called the Rape of Nanjing. The old way of saying it is Rape of Nanking. Do you want to share anything you might know about that? Anybody? No? Yes? No? No? Essentially, it's called the Rape of Nanking because that's what happened. The entire city was just like sacked by the Japanese, and the Japanese went around and they raped as many Chinese women as they possibly could get their hands on. It is absolutely gruesome stuff. In my opinion, it's as gruesome, if not more gruesome, than what Hitler did to the Jews in the Holocaust, in the concentration camps. Some of the pictures I've seen are absolutely brutal. And from what I can tell, how do normal, everyday people do this kind of stuff to other human beings? What has to happen? What has to change inside of your head in order for you to just be able to do that to another human being? And what happened was the Japanese, and this is back then, not today, right? So don't think that I'm making any kind of racist statement about today, right? Today, what happened was, or back then, what happened was the Japanese people would bring in new recruits, the military brass, they would bring in new recruits, and they would like literally bring a prisoner out in front of them and show them the prisoner and then shoot the prisoner in the head. And of course, all the new recruits were like, oh my gosh, why we just see what we saw? And then, in order to associate killing with pleasure, they would get them, the new recruits, drunk, get them prostitutes, so they would associate sexual pleasure and drunkenness and the highs that you get with that with killing. And so it was like a way to massively train an entire army to do horrible things that they did to the people of Manchuria. It was just awful. Okay, and how could normal, everyday, average, because it's not like, do you think that every single Nazi, every single soldier in the German army was an evil person down to the core out of those tens of millions of people? Probably not, right? So how do you get somebody to do the awful things that they did to the Jews and other people during the Holocaust? Well, meth. I'm just following orders, right? Meth on the front lines, definitely, to try to get them to keep going at that pace, but which were on their body. But in the concentration camps, how do you get an average person to do? Well, they just, what most people said when they were on trial, I was just following orders. Somebody ahead of me told me to do it, and I have to do it. I can't disobey my commanding officer, right? There's been a ton of studies done to show that even people like you and me will shock people to the point where they're like almost dead because somebody gave us orders. If you want to look that up, it's the Stanley Milgram experiment. Okay, having said that, Japan invaded Manchuria in 1937. When we ended last week, we were talking about the Neutrality Acts, and the Neutrality Act said we're not allowed to give any aid at all to anybody who's in a state of war if the president has said that they're in a state of war. So what FDR does, because he sees all the negative, the nasty, the horrible things that are happening in China, and he doesn't want to do nothing, because he's done nothing up here, right? Nothing. He doesn't want to do nothing. He says that Japan, that its invasion of Manchuria, is not war. Therefore, they could send munitions, which means food, especially weapons, but also supplies and aid to the Chinese. And he makes a speech called the quarantine speech. And you should all know by now, during this era that we've had, what a quarantine is, right? What's a quarantine? You're isolated. You're blocked off from everybody else. But what FDR is saying here is that Americans, we've got to start trying to quarantine the aggressor nations of the world, try to keep them inside their little box. That doesn't mean we send soldiers yet, but we got to do something. We can't just sit by and watch the world burn. Now, 1937 and 1938, you might remember that is the Roosevelt recession. You might remember that was the depression within the depression. And so there's also an economic reason for us to get involved in the war. There is overseas demand for war goods. Britain needs stuff. France needs stuff before they fell, obviously. And so Congress, kind of following the president's lead here just a little bit, amends the Neutrality Act of 1939. And this phrase is actually a phrase from the end of course exam. The Neutrality Act of 1939 says there can be a cash and carry policy. Cash and carry. What does that mean? The United States doesn't want to get involved in a war as much as we possibly can. So, if Britain and France want any weapons from us, or China, or any of the allies want anything from us, they've got to come over on their own ships. We're not going to send our ships, because last time we did that, World War I, they got blown up, right? They got to send their ships. They've got to pay cash up front, no loans, and then they've got to carry it back on their own boats. Cash and carry. This is our first, this right here, the quarantine speech, is our first step away from total neutrality. This is the next step away from total neutrality. But notice, they're still trying to satisfy the isolationists in the American First people. Of course, we have Hitler invading Poland. Hitler wasn't the only one who invaded Poland in 1939. Who was the other? Russia, the Soviets invaded Poland in 1939. With the non-aggression pact, you can see the Soviets back then took 3-4 areas right here in their attempt to try to get land back, right? And they, of course, today, modern day, this is where Ukraine would be, where it says the words Eastern Poland are. Okay, so the fall of France yielded Winston Churchill as a prime minister, and by this point, France has fallen. England stands alone. There's only one country left between Hitler's total domination of Europe, right? And the question is, should we help our old ally? And remember, Battle of Britain, the London Blitz, the Luftwaffe was bombing France, or was bombing London constantly. And so it's at this point that FDR takes his next step towards getting involved. And it's not, we're going to go send out our army and our navy out there. It's, we're going to protect us in case it comes here. FDR calls on Congress to build a 2-ocean navy and an air fleet in case it spreads to the United States. Now, of course, this causes there to be a lot of debt because we're not being able to pay it off. So we're getting into debt to do this. And this is going to be a thing of wars. They cost tons of money. And then, in September of 1940, we have the first peacetime draft ever in American history. We are not involved in a war. We have not declared war, and we have a draft just to make sure that we're ready. Now, in the Havana Conference of 1940, we agreed that we are going to protect our Caribbean neighbors. All those islands and stuff that are down there in the Caribbean Sea. The German U-boats have started attacking out there because they're sending supplies over to the Allies. Well, we're going to protect them. So this is our next step in taking just that next step towards being involved in the war. Then there is, of course, the America First Committee, and formed in opposition to them is it doesn't like roll off the tongue quite as well as America First. The Committee to Defend America by aiding the Allies. the CDAA. Now, in addition to that, while Britain is still fighting off the Nazis, we have the destroyer deal, or the destroyer for bases deal. This is another one that's on the end of course exam curriculum. Winston Churchill is here in England, and he and Roosevelt are kind of like they're kind of buddies by this point. They've been talking a lot on the phone, telegraphing back and forth, and Churchill's constantly in FDR's ear whispering, we got to have help, you got to help us. If we fall, then you're next, that kind of thing. And so FDR says, all right, fine. Here's what we'll do. Here's FDR signing the first peacetime draft. The destroyer for bases deal said, Britain, we will loan you these. We're not giving them to you. We'll loan these to you. 50 destroyers from World War I in exchange for 8 military bases around the world that we can use. That used to be yours, now they're ours. Destroyer for bases deal. It was a loan, and of course, you know what happens with loans, right? Okay, so most of you, this is how it should work. When you go to the library, and you get a book, you loan it out, right? What should you do with that book? Give it back, correct? How many of you actually do that?
I've got a book out. It's been out for 2 years, and I didn't even know I had it out.
Why am I not surprised? Us too, by the way. We got to pay $15 for some monkey book. My kids got.
That's how they get you.
That's the question. Like, do you want a loaned boat back if it's been blown up? So that you can see there's some critics there, probably. But just so you can see the extent of what's happening in Europe, the fall of France went like that, right? In World War I, France stood firm. They really did. But here you have them. I mean, the Nazis just went all through France, and then in order to not have to rule all of France, there was a puppet government down here in southern France called Vichy France, and there's the capital city of Vichy right there. But they were a Nazi puppet government. So you can see here Hitler at the Eiffel Tower, etc. Battle of Britain. These little airplanes are called Spitfires. Do you know the one technology advantage that they had over the Luftwaffe that helped them beat them in the Battle of Britain?
Oh. Radar.
There you go. Now, in the midst of this, in all of this happening, and we're not involved in the war yet, but we're kind of edging there a little bit. We've got an election for president. This is awful. When you have elections during the middle of a war. I mean, Abraham Lincoln had to run for re-election during the middle of a war, right? Here is FDR not only running for president during the middle of a war, but doing something unprecedented. No one had ever tried this before. He's running for a third term. Remember, this is before the 22nd Amendment said that there's only 2 terms allowed. We have that cutoff, right? Now, he's allowed to do it, but nobody's ever done it before because who stepped down after 2 terms? George Washington did, right? And he breaks that precedent. He says, I'm running for a third term. He is a Democratic candidate. His running mate at this time is Henry Wallace, who is about as progressive as we've ever had of a vice president, closer to being socialist than we've ever had as any kind of national leader. His opponent in 1940 was Wendell Willkie. Wendell Willkie, the Republican nominee, relatively unknown. His biggest platform was the New Deal is spending too much money, and FDR is possibly going to be a potential dictator. Neither one of them are 100% isolationists by this point. But there are still a ton of people in America who are saying, we can't go and get involved in this war. And so FDR makes this promise. Your boys are not going to be sent to any foreign wars. Campaign slogans. Willkie's was, there's no indispensable man. There's nobody that is so great that we can't do without him. FDR is not some kind of, demigod. And FDR said, better a third termer than a third rater. It's less than of a landslide than it was in 32 and 36, but FDR wins pretty handily. But what this shows is, see this line right here? Neither are isolationists. Despite this promise that FDR made right here, neither one is saying, I'm not going to do nothing. Right? They're both saying we got to do something to address this whole thing. And so isolationism is starting to fade, at least in the national level. Here's some political cartoons. You can see here, FDR is really, he's younger at this point than any of the last two presidents we've had, right? But you can see the Great Depression and the war is starting to wear on him. You can see the gray, you can see the lines on his face starting to come there. And of course, also, he's got polio really, really bad. He's going to die in office 5 years after this. You can see here, Wendell Willkie, no third term. When your only thing is how bad the other guy is, it's not really a good platform because you got to talk about what you're going to do. Political cartoon. FDR bowled over Hoover in 32, Alf Landon in 36, and now he's got a bowl over Wendell Willkie, but he's also got a bowl over who else sitting on Willkie's shoulders? Who is that? It says no third term tradition. That's General Washington, right, on Willkie's shoulders. And sure enough, he did both. He beat Willkie and he won the third term against how Washington might have wanted it. And, Willkie had some followers, there's no doubt. But just like, Donald Trump, who had tons of people come to his rallies, right? Willkie did too, but he still lost. Okay. And those are the number of states that Willkie won. You might remember that Alf Landon only won 2. And so now there's a few more people saying no to FDR, but it's pretty much 54% is a pretty big number. Okay. Another term from the end of course exam curriculum, you might find the Lease Act on the end of course exam, the Lend-Lease Act. This is us going one step farther. Instead of cash and carry now, we will start allowing people to get loans. You can get a loan from us in order to get some supplies. And so we are going to end up sending about $7 billion worth of aid to Britain and France, leasing them weapons, leasing them tanks, leasing them stuff, and we're going to start sending boats. Okay? Now, there are people who are very upset at FDR by this point, the Charles Lindberghs, the American First People. And he basically tells them, and they're like, look, you can't loan them tanks. The tanks are going to get blown up. It's like Logan loaning me a stick of gum, right? What are we going to do with it after you're done with it? You give it back? You want my used chewing gum back? You want a used blown up tank back? That doesn't make any sense, right? And so this is how FDR he's so good at politics. He's so good at just getting people to think about it in practical terms, right? And when this was being signed, he got on the air, did one of his fireside chats, and he said, look, American people, Britain is in the midst of this battle. They need help. We got to supply them some help. It's kind of like this. Britain's our neighbor, right? They're across the ocean, but they're our neighbor. They're our ally. They're big. If you had a neighbor next door to you that their house caught on fire, and you had a hose, a garden hose, that you could use to help put it out, wouldn't you loan it to them? Wouldn't you try to help them put out their fire?
I'd call it fire.
Of course, you can call the fire department, right? But then, don't you do something to help them out? Because that's what good people do, right? You help out people who are in need. And also, think about this. If your neighbor's house is on fire and you don't help, what could happen? It could catch your house on fire, right? And so when you put it like that, it's like the American people are like, oh, I think most of them were convinced by this point. Now, having said that, we're sending our boats over. And so American boats start to sink. The Robin Moore was one of the first. Taylor begins to sink. boats that are carrying American supplies. And at this point, this is like mid 1941. We are not involved in the war yet. We have not sent any troops yet. Hitler makes one of the dumbest tactical military moves he's ever made, ever will make. And that's when he decides to attack the USSR, when he decides to attack Russia. He decides to attack the Soviet Union. He had a pact with them. And he decides that he is going to now attack them. Because if you didn't know this, he hated communists about as much as he hated Jews. And not to mention that there are a ton of Jewish people in Russia as well. And Stalin is not going to have anything over on him, right? And so he thinks that he can be better than Napoleon. Napoleon had attacked Russia in the middle of winter and it failed, and Hitler's going to show I'm better than Napoleon. I'm the best general that there ever was. And so FDR says, well, since they attacked the Soviet Union, let's start sending aid to the Soviet Union. We'll use the Lend-Lease Act to send millions of dollars worth of aid to the Soviets. Somebody can help us beat the Nazis. Sorry? Exactly. He's now in a two-front war against Britain and France on one side and then Russia on the other. Now, I'm going to have you put the word if right there for Atlantic Conference, but for just a second, I'm going to pause on that. Go ahead and flip your notes over. We'll talk about the Atlantic Conference in just a second. But first, I want to show a few cartoons, and you might recognize some of these cartoons from last week. So here we have a Dr. Seuss cartoon, right? You might remember this from last week. And I'd like to just talk about it for a second. Just slow down from the notes and just talk about it. This is Dr. Seuss drawing a quarter. It's called the Lindbergh quarter, and it has an ostrich on it throwing its head into the sand. What's Dr. Seuss's message here? Yeah. Who's hiding? Who's sticking their head in the sand? Who's the ostrich? Specifically in the United States, who? The isolationists, right? The Charles Lindberghs, the America First people, who say we should not help over there because us first, we should care about us first, right? He's saying that you're like an ostrich who buries his head in the sand when danger comes. Now, by the way, ostriches don't really do that. I don't know if you can do that or not. If you thought that ostriches bury their head in the sand, that's fine because I did too. Even while I've been a teacher, right? But I've learned recently that they don't do that. Think about that. Evolution, like if you buy into the whole evolution, survival of the fittest thing, like if an ostrich did that when there was danger, they wouldn't be able to survive to pass on their genes to the next generation, right? They don't really do that. I don't know where it came from. But the point is, if you bury your head in the sand, you are ripe for being attacked by the enemy. Don't do that. Question.
Alright, so ostriches' necks are so tiny, so how would they...
Let's not talk about ostriches right now. Let's get through this here, okay? You can talk about the political cartoons, but not ostriches. Okay, now look at this one right here. This one. Right here. You've got the America First Committee in the bathtub. What is the bathtub? Meaning, what ocean specifically? The Atlantic Ocean. Right? America First Committee says the old family bathtub is plenty safe for me. What's his folly here? What's Dr. Seuss saying about this America First guy? Yeah. It's not going to protect us. Look at all of the German U-boats that are in here that's going to blow us out of the water, just like they did in World War I. Right? Now, look here. America First Grandma. This is a grandma who's an isolationist. She is reading a story to her grandchildren, and the story is called Adolf the Wolf, and we all know who he's referring to there, right? Adolf the Wolf. And she says to them, this is the end of the story, and the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones. But those were foreign children, and it didn't really matter. What's Dr. Seuss saying here?
That we don't care about
foreign children dying.
Like, if you do that, is he saying, yay, we should not care about foreign children dying because they're not our children? Is that what he's saying? No, he's saying that's ridiculous. Why would you do that? Why would you have that mentality? That's terrible. You can see here this one. The American First Committee and the Nazis are basically connected. They may not be in league with the Nazis, although there might have been some, because there were Nazi like camps and parties here. There were, I promise. But at the very least, isolationism is helping out the Nazis, right? And the Neutrality Acts, we have all of this potential to help out the rest of the world, but our Neutrality Acts are keeping that aid from going there. That aid could help win and see our Congress needs to fix our problems. And then when we do get to the Lend-Lease Act, what's happening with we get 2/3 of the way to England, and what happens? Right? So we've got to get involved, is what he's saying, like with our military, what he's saying here. This is Operation Barbarossa. This is Hitler's decision to try to get into Russia. And now Uncle Joe is our pal. Joseph Stalin is now nicknamed Uncle Joe, which is terrible considering how many people he killed. But, the enemy of your enemy is your friend, I guess. So there you go. Okay, Atlantic Charter. This is also in the end of course exam notes if you want to circle that term, you can. The Atlantic Charter is when Churchill and FDR get together off the coast of the Atlantic Ocean, Newfoundland, somewhere around in there, and they say, this is what should happen if the United States gets involved in the war. This is what should happen if we win. Notice what he says. Trade barriers should be lowered. All peoples, including colonies, should have the right to self-determination. Freedom of the seas. Disarmament. A future international peacekeeping organization. One that will work, not the League of Nations that let the world burn. Does that sound like anybody else's document that we've talked about before that you'll need to know for the course exam from World War I? Sounds like the 14 points, Woodrow Wilson. I'm not a fan of Woodrow Wilson, but dude was right on this, it seems. Okay, let's skip through these because I don't want to go through all of these. But so FDR starts using convoys to protect our boats. These are Navy ships to help protect the boats that are going across the sea to give aid to the Allies. But you can see the Greer, the Kearney, the Reuben James blown up, September and October of 1941. The Neutrality Act of 1939, cash and carry is repealed, and so that at this point we're saying we can send any aid to them, France and Britain, and even Russia now, regardless of whether or not they have the money, regardless of whether or not they can carry it themselves. Here's some of the boats that were blown up there. And this is the area where the Germans were specifically attacking, just like they had done in World War I. Now, all of that is going on with Germany, but as you know, Pearl Harbor is what got us involved in World War II, and that was the Japanese. So let's shift over then to that, because it wasn't Hitler that got us involved, it was the Japanese Empire that got us involved. The invasion of Manchuria in China in 1937 showed us how brutal the Japanese people were at that point in time. And of course, Japan was allied with Germany and Italy to become the Axis powers. Japan had wanted a Pacific Ocean empire. They wanted room to breathe. They wanted to expand, just like Hitler was in Europe. And so they wanted our islands that we had, like the Philippines, like Guam, like Midway Island. And as you watched in the video, the United States put an embargo or economic sanctions on Japanese supplies. We're going to make sure we stop trading with you to show you our discontent with your desire. You have kept expanding. You've kept, attacking China. These are actually kind of racist, so I'm not going to go through those right now. Even Dr. Seuss had some Yeah.
He knows his boundaries.
Actually, Dr. Seuss was quote unquote canceled recently because of some of these anti-Asian stereotypes.
Just cat laugh.
That I don't know.
Black and
I can't speak to that.
cat laugh.
So in mid-1941, we put an embargo on their oil to try to stop their war machine. And then we tried to negotiate in November and December of 1941 with the Japanese because we're starting to crack their codes using the magic machine. It was a code, it was an early form of a computer. We're trying to figure out how to make sure that the Japanese don't, that we can find out what they're actually up to. And we cracked their codes and we realized that they are actually like planning an attack on us. We don't know when, we don't know where, but we know that there's some kind of attack coming. This is early December of 1941. And you can see here some of the decoding machines. These are early forms of computers, but eventually by the end of the war, they get to be basically the size of a room trying to decode what the Japanese and the Germans are putting out there. And you can see here where the Japanese had expanded to by the time they attacked Pearl Harbor. Yeah, we'll talk about that soon. And so, trying to figure out how to stop them, trying to figure out what their code said. We didn't have it in time. The negotiations didn't work. And so, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. FDR asked against, in his Day of Infamy speech the next day for a declaration of war on Japan in Congress. Overwhelmingly, I think there was like one person who voted no, maybe two. 500 some people in Congress say yes. More damage done in this one day to our fleet than had been done to our entire Navy during all of our action in World War I. And that was when isolationism ended. That is when we, right? And Dr. Seuss here says he never knew what hit him. And I think Dr. Seuss was trying to tell us, yeah, he should have known because it was coming this whole time. So Germany and Italy declared war on the United States a few days later. And so therefore, we declared war back on them. And now we entered the war as a combatant. The problem is, we've got to build a two-ocean navy, a two-continent army, and essentially what FDR called the arsenal of democracy. Technically, the arsenal of democracy started before this, sending all those supplies over to Britain and France. But yes. Yeah, go ahead.
One of there's like a bunch of things that people say that it was a big thing.
Just real quick while you're everybody get out your Chromebook. I want to see. I've got a short quizzes that I want you to take to see what's going on in your brain.
One being that you can't keep it active very well.
Is it?
Right. I need to let it go. Another thing is that when you recently attacked Russia with you give you oil, you probably could have asked Russia for oil.
Since they had a thing already.
Yeah, because what and you almost got the oil
Very much agree.
So
No, they took that last night.
basically one of the weaker